Have you seen that podcast with on Alistair Campbell, Rory Stewart, with the MI5 and MI6 guys?
Yeah.
What did you think about that?
Yeah, I think they're all right. I mean, some of those podcasts I think are interesting. Again, I think they can be, some of them are really, really good. I don't think they do perform a service because they're bringing intelligence to the public, which hasn't really happened in the past. Some of them, again, I think a bit nerdy. And I think often they need to be challenged more. So often I've found those podcasts, I mean, maybe lots of podcasts like that. But I think at least the Alistair Campbell and the Rory Stewart, the premise is one's Labour, one Conservative, and they sort of go at each other in a nice way. But there's a tension between the two. But most intelligence podcasts seem to be, this is the intelligence narrative, and no one actually just pushing back on that, even gently, and challenging it. It's very much a sort of received wisdom. This is the way we are. And they'll have an interviewer and a guest, and the interview is quite soft and they're sympathetic. So I think sometimes you need like a nice tension. That sort of thing.
It helps for the actual interview.
Yeah, I think so, and I think you get more from it as well. Really, I think most people are okay being challenged. It's just there's a difference of opinion sometimes, but I think they are good and they're informative. But I just wish they were a little bit more critical of had a critical element of them.
Is there anything that sticks out to you which was glaringly obvious that needed to be criticised?
I think Alistair Campbell's one is interesting because he's so invested in 2003 in the war in Iraq and the extent to which intelligence was politicized, I think, at that point by the Blair administration to create a case for war. So I think he's very careful about defending himself and saying, we did nothing wrong. I think by the letter of the law, he's probably correct. But morally and ethically, they knew they were sexing up the intelligence. They were putting more weight on it. They could bear, really. They were pushing intelligence services in a particular direction to come up with particular findings. So they were politicizing that process in ways that helped them, for their agenda to go to war. And I think often he's not as honest about that process as he should be, really, saying, look, we decided we were going to go to war. We needed to make a case. We wanted the intelligence services to help us. And they were literally going out to them saying, find us evidence that matches what we want to say, rather than just tell us what's happening and give us the truth. So that objectivity, I think, was really blurred and lost a bit.
In today's episode, we had Paul Mcgarr, an intelligence agency professor and researcher who researched a lot about intelligence agencies, the history behind it, because he's originally a historian. And we talked about the CIA, KGB, Mossad, Chinese intelligence, but also his work, which is Indian intelligence and Global South intelligence, which is not often talked about and which has a really interesting background.
Yeah, Mcgarr's a bit of a superstar in India. He's most famous for his book called Spying in South Asia, which I think is actually a bestseller.
Superstar indeed, and hope you enjoy some spicy stuff talked about in this podcast. And see you later.
The Inspire Us podcast.
Paul, welcome. Thank you. Well, you study intelligence, and so we're going to talk about a lot of things, but you mentioned you weren't always studying intelligence. You were a historian. How did you get into intelligence, and what did you find so interesting about it?
So there's a long and a short story for that, but I'll give you guys the shortest story because the long one.
I mean, you can go long. We have time.
Incredible. So I'm a historian of South Asia initially, and I got into being interested in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, that South Asia region, really, when I was quite young. And I traveled around that region and did a lot of sort of solo traveling and traveled around backpacking in the region, became fascinated by the people and the culture, and just really fell in love with that region particularly. And then I went on to become a historian and sort of gravitated towards writing a history of South Asia. And one of the reasons was, and I think this sort of fills in with intelligence really, that when I came to want to know more about South Asia as a region, and particularly Britain's interest in South Asia, coming from the United Kingdom, what's Britain's post-independent history of South Asia? So if you go to a library or you go online or look at television, you will find hundreds and hundreds of programs and books, thousands in fact, about Britain's imperial history in South Asia. So right up until 1947, when Britain was in control of South Asia, huge amounts of imperial nostalgia and books written about the Raj and Britain's colonial empire in South Asia. But when you want to look at books after 1947, or at least 10 or 20 years ago, there were very few really good academic books or even books that were targeting a mass market that were quite informative about what happened after 1947. And, this notion that, any colonial power, whether it be in Africa or Asia or South America or elsewhere, suddenly decides to leave on on a January day and then everything changes is just a fallacy, really. It's a much longer and drawn out process of decolonization, both politically, economically, unwinding hundreds of years of connections, economic, political, social, cultural. It takes time. And so I was really frustrated that there was just nothing was written about this process. And what happened after August 1947 when the British left? How did the process pan out? What was the relationship? What were the tensions? And particularly given the fact that, so much of British history post 1947 was wound up in South Asia, the so-called living bridge, where millions of people of South Asian heritage live, work, and grow up in the UK. And the connection between the two is still very much live and functioning today, but very, very little written about that, really. And interesting, I was speaking to friends from South Asian heritage and saying, well, what can you tell me? And they're saying, we don't really know anything about our history. We have very little. Our parents didn't talk about it. We don't really know about it. Certainly, we don't know about it in British context, aside from what they were experiencing on the news. And they'd lived everyday lives, I guess, and how that was experienced. So that sort of got me into South Asian history. So I researched and wrote a book on Britain's relationship with South Asia from 1947 to the end of the 1960s. And that was a sort of political history. So it encompassed diplomacy and stuff like that. But it also dealt with issues like immigration and racism and culture and all sorts of, big sort of broad swathe of how that relationship developed over time. And I wrote it. And when I was writing it, I kept coming across this notion of a secret sort of history that underlay it, which wasn't really public, but was in the archives about an intelligence relationship. And the interesting thing for me was it was one of the things that stayed after 1947. So, if you think about Britain's break with India in 1947, economically, it took quite a long time to unwind. So Britain was still India's biggest trading partner, had a huge stake in the Indian economy well into the late 1960s, early 1970s. So there's still an economic dependency between London and India during that period. Socially and culturally, those links sort of stayed together. But one of the strongest links I found, I kept coming across, was intelligence. It was like, well, what's happened? Britain was really important to Indian intelligence after 1947 because India had lots of threats, both internally. It was struggling to keep India together as a coherent nation state. So when India was made independent in 1947, there was a lot of talk about, well, India's going to fracture, it's going to split up, and no one can keep this country together because it's an imperial construct. It was created by the British. There wasn't an India before Britain came, and there were lots of princely states and other sort of facets of the way India's political geography worked. And the British cohered that state into a nation. And once they leave, it'll just fracture. So there was this notion that was going to happen. That didn't happen. But there was lots of pressure on India to make sure that didn't happen and to keep the population under control. And one of the ways of doing that is intelligence and security, to know what people are thinking and feeling, get on top of political agitation, know where social dissent might be forming. So intelligence was an important component of that. And then they had external threats from People's Republic of China, which went communist in 1949, October 1949. They had threats from Pakistan because of the division, the partition of the subcontinent in 1947. So they had strong external threats and strong internal threats. And they weren't really left in a condition where they could handle those because Britain had left India in a terrible state. Lots of economic extraction. Britain had sort of exploited India as a sort of an economic cash cow really throughout its 200-year sort of colonial occupation. So it was in a terrible state. It was deindustrialized. It didn't have the sort of capacity to do that. So one of the interesting things I found was decolonization happened in August 1947. The British stayed on in certain ways, economically, socially to some extent, but they stayed on in intelligence terms as well, because India needed the British in terms of their intelligence capacity to stabilize the state externally and internally. So the British were sort of left essentially in 1947 militarily, but in terms of intelligence, India pretty quickly said, can you come back and help us? Can you train our intelligence officers? Can you give us support? Can you be there as a sort of, while we pick our intelligence process up and effectively create an intelligence service from scratch? One of the other reasons for intelligence, and it was so important, was every intelligence officer in India prior to 1947 was British. All the junior officers may have been Indian, but they weren't really trusted. So there was this notion of no one was trained, no Indian officials were trained to take over an intelligence function. So when the British left in 1947, they took all the intelligence officers with them and they burnt all the intelligence records as well. So there's no institutional history. So India's starting literally from ashes with no staff trained in intelligence, or very few, and certainly none at senior level, and no institutional record of how to run an intelligence service or who was being monitored at that particular time. So yeah, it was an interesting sort of story that hadn't really been told in depth and I found really fascinating. And the longer I traced it through, it just kept going. So I thought, well, by the mid-1950s, this is going to peter out, but it didn't. And then you got to the mid-1960s and it didn't. And it just kept going into the 1970s and 1980s. So a really strong relationship that had a really long afterlife, much longer than I thought it would have during that period, and much longer than other things. I mean, surprisingly, like the last head of the Indian Navy, who was British. So again, when the British left India in 1947, they sort of left, they sort of didn't leave. So the head of the Pakistani and British Indian Armed Forces was British for quite a few years after partition. And the head of the Indian Navy was British until 1958. Wow. So there was a serving Royal Navy British officer in charge of the Indian Navy over 10 years following the India's independence, effectively. So that transition took a long time. But intelligence seems to take longer than any other sort of facet, really. So that's what sort of drew me to it.
So you found that there's this relationship of intelligence with Britain and India and even Pakistan.
Yep.
And so what happens after that? So there's this relationship. How did Britain use that? Like, what happens next?
It's an interesting relationship between, I guess one of the first points I'd make is there's a different relationship between Pakistan and India. So for various reasons, India at independence in 1947 initially gravitates towards Britain for lots of things, economically, militarily, and in terms of intelligence. It looks to London to help. And partly that's because of the colonial connection. And Jawaharlal Nehru, his first prime minister, has been regarded as India's last Englishman to rule India. Very much an Anglophile, very embedded in British high society and British culture. So he naturally gravitated towards Britain, I think, because he felt comfortable with British people. And Nehru had a sort of aversion to Americans, but not America. Nehru really liked America, and he admired its democracy, and he admired its entrepreneurial spirit, and lots of things about America. Really, Nehru thought was a model really for any society. What he didn't like was American capitalism and its brashness and what he regarded as excessive greed and wealth inequality and again the racial system of segregation in southern United States. Obviously really grated with Nehru being a sort of arch proponent of anti-colonialism. So lots of things about the American social and political system Nehru wasn't attracted to. So he tended to sort of shy away from the United States and gravitate towards Britain in that sense. Pakistan had an opposite experience, I think, but for very different reasons. Pakistan gravitated towards the United States for its security, largely because it was faced with an antagonistic relationship with India. So India being a much bigger state, much larger population, much larger land mass, much stronger army. Pakistan felt that it was always at risk of irredentism from India. So India's going to claw back Pakistan to make this greater India once again after partition in 1947. Britain refused to take sides militarily or politically between India and Pakistan because they're both states of the Commonwealth. So it basically followed a process or a policy of neutrality, but the United States didn't. And so Pakistan was able to go to the United States and say, can you help us with military aid, intelligence support? Pakistan wanted that to offset Indian power, but it didn't tell the United States that, even though America knew. It basically said this is to guard against communism. We're Pakistan borders, or borders at that time, southern states of the Soviet Union. So basically the Pakistanis went, if you want us to help against communism, we will, but you'll have to give us military support, intelligence support, which Americans were only too willing to do because it was a strategic location. It was useful for spying on the Soviet Union. But of course, Pakistan didn't use it for that. Pakistan used it against India. So they had very different journeys in intelligence terms. Pakistan really aligning itself with the Central Intelligence Agency, and India being quite wary about the CIA and instead aligning itself with MI5, the British Security Service. And that, interesting, is a story in itself.
Was there a conflict between sort of the Brits and the Americans within the subcontinent?
Yeah, there was. There was tension between the two, I think. So in India particularly, but also in Pakistan, there's a sort of competitive cooperation. So overall, both services, so the CIA in India and MI5, and also later British MI6 also operated in India. But initially there's some tension between the two because they both have an overarching aim, and that overarching aim is to keep India free and democratic, to make sure that India doesn't go communist. And that's a big thing in the 1950s because we think about it, China goes communist in October 1949. Hundreds of millions of people in Asia go communist overnight. You've got the shock of the Korean War in the early 1950s as well. If India had gone communist as well, then I think that would, psychologically, it's a big blow to the United States. And everything's binary, isn't it, in the Cold War? So any gain for communism is a defeat for capitalism, and the free world, and the United States being the leader of the free world, it would be a big issue. So America did pump lots of economic aid and also sort of political support into keeping India free. And Britain was absolutely behind that. I think less so because Britain was worried about communism, although Britain was worried about communism in India. But Britain was more focused on the economic stake it had in India and the political stake it had in India through the Commonwealth as well. So India was important to Britain for other reasons, aside from communism. Economically and politically, there was still a valuable relationship for Britain to have if it kept close to India during that period. So they had an overarching aim that was similar, but there was competitive tension between the two, largely because I think they had different approaches. Like MI thought the Americans were blundering; they were too obvious in the way they were approaching things, and they're too aggressive in their intelligence tactics. So it was less strategic issues and more tactical issues about how they were going about doing that. I think between the two, but there was quite a lot of tension between them. Yeah.
Where does the KGB fit into this puzzle?
Yeah, so the KGB became very active in India. So really from 1947 onwards, the Soviet Union had an interest in India. And there's this narrative about a great intelligence game that's fought between the British Empire and the Tsarist Empire, going back into the 18th and 19th century, centered around Afghanistan, but also the northwest frontier province of what was then British India, but came to be Pakistan. So there'd always been an intelligence conflict between Russia, Imperial Russia, and Imperial Britain. And when that process sort of peters out really at the beginning of the 20th century, but it's reignited really after the Bolshevik Revolution, and Lenin very much sees India, when he comes to power in the 1920s, as a strategic prize. If India goes communist, it's going to be a big thing for the Russian Revolution. It could be a big fillip during that period. So there's that sort of competition. But really, Russia's much more focused on internal dynamics then. It's in a terrible state because of the revolution. It's not really particularly externally focused. And Stalin, when Stalin comes to power in the 1930s, he and after India becomes independent in 1947, he very much sees India still as a sort of British lackey. So Stalin looks at India and says, well, economically, they're still dependent on Britain. Militarily, they're still dependent on Britain. Are they actually even independent? And so there's the relationship between the Soviet Union and India is really quite frosty until Stalin dies in 1953. And then a new wave of Soviet leaders come, Nikita Khrushchev, Malenkov, Bolkhanin come to power in sort of the mid-1950s, and they take a very different view. And their view is very much about exporting the revolution. So Stalin's really about Eastern European and internal consolidation, but a new Khrushchev particularly is about taking the revolution to Africa, to Asia, to Latin America, to really expanding the revolution. And India's seen as a prize target. So Khrushchev goes to India with Bolkhanin in 1955. And that's very much a process of saying, look, we will help you, we'll give you economic aid, we'll give you political support, we're really going to be really friendly to you. So he's trying to drive a wedge between India and the West, really, the United States and Great Britain. And it's relatively successful. India's quite pragmatic about it. They're like, well, we're non-aligned. We're taking support from the United States and Britain if we can get it. But if the Russians want to give us aid, economic aid, then fine, we'll take it from both sides. So they sort of play both sides of the street, really. But a lot of that's wrapped up in intelligence as well. So Indians have been complaining that Soviet intelligence had been operating in India really from 1947 onwards, but on a low level, not really a big level. But after 1955, the KGB really began to ramp up their focus on India. So when Bolkhanin and Khrushchev meet Nehru in 1955, actually one of the items on their agenda, it's not published at the time, but we now know because records have been released. Nehru basically says to them, you are funding the Indian Communist Party. Stop funding Indian communists to undermine our democratic experiment in India. We know you're doing it. We can trace the money. And one of the reasons, interesting, that the Indians can trace the money is MI5 is telling us the money routes that the Soviets that are using through southern Russia to get money into India to fund the Indian Communist Party. So the British go to India and say, look, this is the evidence. This is what Moscow's doing. They are sending money into India to fund the Communist Party, and this is how it's working. Some of that, interestingly, comes through London. It comes through the British Communist Party in London and through Indian expatriates who are living in London. So there are lots of different ways Moscow gets money into India, but MI5 are tracking it. And Nehru goes to Khrushchev with his evidence and says, look, this is the evidence. We know you're doing it. And Khrushchev bluffs it out and says, no, we're not doing it. I promise you we're not interfering. Because it's nonsense. He's lying to Nehru's face, and Nehru knows it. But that sort of process just continues on, really. And it becomes, I think, as the Soviets become more and more focused on a global Cold War, which really begins to take sort of shape already from the mid-1950s onwards, but certainly by the end of the 1950s, early 1960s, the Soviet KGB is massive in India. And by the time we get to the 1970s, it's the biggest intelligence footprint in India by far. It's much bigger than CIA. It's much bigger than MI5.
But isn't
it's
that
enormous.
conflict of interest a little bit if you have MI5 and KGB operating and the government using both sides?
Yeah.
Like, how does that work?
So MI5 still had, until MI5 leaves India, interestingly, in the late 1960s. Again, that's a fascinating story as well. So, but in the late 1960s, formerly British intelligence or British domestic intelligence, MI5, quits India in the late 1960s. And you would imagine it's because the Indians kicked them out. It's absolutely the reverse. The Indians are begging the British to stay in 1968. And the reason Britain and MI5 leave India is financial reasons. The British Treasury says we cannot afford to keep MI5 officers stationed around the globe. And MI5 officers are stationed in Africa and the Caribbean and Asia and various sort of stations. And the Treasury basically says the British economy is in such, a bit like today, in such bad shape in the late 1960s. You know, we've got the devaluation of the pound, the Wilson government's really struggling. So basically the Treasury goes to the British Intelligence Service and says, right, you've got to retrench, you've got to bring your officers home because we can't afford to keep them. And so the MI5 officers are withdrawn from India. And the Indians get really upset. They go to the British and say, we want you to keep your officers here. Wow. They're really useful to us. We're finding them really useful. And the British say, I'm sorry, we just can't. The security services try to keep them, try to make a financial case, and they just lose to the Treasury. And the Treasury is always quite powerful, isn't it, in British politics? And they decide to bring them home. So that process that's how it plays out. British MI6, British External Intelligence Service, had actually been kicked out of India in 1947. So again, that's an interesting story. The Indians welcome MI5 into India because they want security support. And security intelligence is about, internal stuff, monitoring communists, that sort of stuff. What they don't want is spies. They don't want British intelligence spying on what the Indian government are doing. So MI6 put officers into India in 1947, even though local British politicians, the High Commission, effectively the British ambassador in India, basically says this is a really bad idea. We shouldn't be spying on India, that this is not going to work out well. But MI6 insist on putting intelligence officers, effectively espionage officers, into India at the same time as MI5 officers are working there. And the Indians realize pretty quickly who they are and that they are spying and they're running agents and they're spying what the Indian government are doing. And they basically declare them persona non grata and kick them out. So the two SIS officers that get put into India are identified very quickly and are basically said they're expelled by the Indian government, which obviously creates tensions between the two. And they don't get back into India, MI6, until 1964. So there's a hiatus from 1948 It's from 1964 when SIS are effectively banned from operating in India because they think they're going to create diplomatic problems if they're caught spying. And they get back into India in 1964 because India goes to war with China in 1962. It loses that war. It wants even more intelligence support from the West, but it wants particularly covert action support, paramilitary support, that sort of stuff, which MI6 do. And then it welcomes MI6 back into India at that point. And they've stayed ever since, really, undeclared in the government, but they are operating in India today. So it's a complex sort of back and forth of different intelligence agencies within that sort of sense. But the KGB have never had a formal agreement with the Indian government in the way that British have. So Britain operated often in intelligence terms with the knowledge of the Indian government, but the KGB have never done that. But again, it's a complex relationship because India doesn't want to antagonize Russia because it gets lots of military aid and economic aid from the Soviet Union. So it sort of tolerated the KGB in India, even it knew what it was doing, as long as it didn't get out of control. So there's this tacit agreement: we'll tolerate some intelligence officers, Soviet intelligence officers, in India, as long as we feel they're not crossing a line which we think is inappropriate. So,
were the KGB responsible for Kerala being the first or the only communist state within India?
Yeah, so I think Kerala is an interesting one. So Kerala, obviously 1957, Kerala goes communist. And it's interesting because I think it's the first major provincial government anywhere in the world to democratically elect a communist government. I think San Marino had, but Pakistan really is like 400 people, isn't it? So no, it doesn't really count so much. But Kerala is a major state in it. It's the first, and that did send shockwaves through Washington, particularly because it comes at the height of the Cold War, and America's paranoid about Soviet power.
Did it feel like India was about to fall?
Yeah, and I think they think it's like a wedge thing. It's like, well, if Kerala goes, then another state will go. And India had been fighting a communist insurgency from 1949 onwards, and that had been quite violent in southern India. The Indian government manages to contain it and suppress it, and it sort of goes away to some extent. But there's always a sense that India's on the verge of going communist or having a big communist revolution within India, potentially a violent revolution as well. So Kerala is a really big shock to the West. I think it's a little bit of shock to the Indian government as well that communists could make such inroads. I think Russia does meddle in Kerala, but it's one of those ones where I'm really suspicious of agency. We always tend to assume that external intelligence agencies are responsible for coups and overthrowing governments, and to some extent, often they're meddling. But I don't think that they have the power to be decisive. So I would say one of the reasons the communists get elected in Kerala in 1957 is because the local communist government is so inefficient and corrupt. So it's local reasons and local agency. It's the local population saying, we don't want this government because they're not delivering for us. They're not delivering education. They're not delivering social welfare. There's wealth inequality. We want land reform. That's not happening. So the local Congress government in Kerala was just really inefficient and ineffective. And it's unsurprising to some ways that they were kicked out and a communist government sort of replaced them. Really, I don't think it was massively externally directed. There would have been some support from Moscow, but not on a scale that's going to make it decisive. So like, Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1950, we often think, oh, well, it's the CIA engineering this and being puppet masters. I don't think any intelligence agency really is capable of doing that without strong local reasons that are also combining with it. Both, effectively, I think, in those situations. So there's a lot of pushback now against Iran in 1953, saying, yes, the CIA was involved, and yes, British intelligence was involved, but there's also a strong undercurrent of what's going on in terms of Iranians on the street that are making a difference. So similar sort of thing in India really. But then the British and the Americans both do intervene. I think the biggest and the most decisive thing perhaps in Kerala is not what caused Kerala, but what caused ultimately the communist government there to get replaced. So under the Indian constitution, it's a federal constitution, the federal government can order a state government to be replaced. So they can take out their chief minister, the governor effectively of a state, and put them under what's called president's rule. So the president can impose direct rule on a state if he declares a national emergency in that state. And that's what happens in Kerala in 1959. So the communist government survives for 2 years, and then Delhi say, we're not happy with what's going on here. We're going to declare a state of emergency and we're going to kick the communist government out completely, undemocratically. They're not ever defeated the ballot box. It's an imposition of direct rule from the centre of the Indian political sort of spectrum. And I think largely that's because of unrest within Kerala. And that unrest is promoted and funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. And interestingly, it's with the full cooperation of the Indian government. So the CIA do buy off labour leaders, pay for strikes, fund people to go out march on the streets and create political agitation and unrest in Kerala. But it's, American intelligence is at the heart of that. But they're doing it in partnership with the Indian government in Delhi. So again, it's another strange thing where, normally a democratic government is working with a foreign intelligence service to overthrow a democratically elected state government in its own country. So it's a complex web of what's going on in Kerala in 1957.
So I guess that's one of the things, is, especially in the global south, it's so easy to blame a regime change on the CIA and external forces. But without people within the country wanting it, it just can't happen.
Yeah, I think you need to have... certainly, the Central Intelligence Agency at various points in its history. It's formed in 1947, and it goes through what's called, ironically, I think, a golden era of CIA operations from the sort of late 1940s through maybe to the mid-1960s or early 1970s, in which it is actively involved in trying to subvert lots of governments across the global south. Actually begins in Italy, trying to engineer elections in Italy in the late 1940s when it looks Italy might go communist. And then it moves to Iran and Guatemala and Indonesia and various other places, trying to influence domestic politics in those countries. So undoubtedly CIA money and interventions do have an impact in places like Guatemala. But I think you're absolutely right. I think ultimately they would fall on stony ground unless there was underlying discontent in those populations. So there's some sort of move. I don't think the CIA can take a perfectly happy and functioning and socially progressive democracy and suddenly decide we have the capacity to change that. So it needs to be both, I think.
What is the point then of intelligence? Because I've heard that the CIA was founded and it was supposed to be kind of this newspaper-ish, information-based for the president. But then you just spoke about here this example about, Italy and overtaking the government. So it seems like it's supposed to be this newspaper, but from the jump, they're doing covert operations.
Yeah, so I think there is a big debate still in intelligence circles about what the function of an state intelligence agency should be. Is it about acquiring information that gives policymakers decision advantage, i.e. giving them information about their adversaries, whether it be economic, political, social, that enables them to make better decisions than people they're pitching their countries against? So in the Ukraine, if we could get better information than Putin, can we make a better decision on Putin? Not just on the battlefield, but strategically. So that notion of acquiring information that is not in the public domain, so it's not open source, it's secret, it's hidden, using espionage or whatever means necessary to acquire that information, just to give policymakers the options of making better choices and better decisions. So lots of people in the intelligence world think that's the primary mission of intelligence services, and they were always conceived that way. But then quite quickly, policymakers decided that intelligence agencies could act as a sort of another secret hidden arm of policy, where they could use covert action, subversion, foment coups, misinformation and disinformation operations, all which could be politically advantageous in destabilizing countries that were their adversaries. So, yeah, quite quickly, the CIA acquired a ability for covert action. But already, it's formed in 1947. Already in 1948, Harry Truman, the American president at the time, saying, "I've got a problem in Italy. You need to help me. You need to destabilize that government. You need to make sure Italy doesn't go communist." So the CIA is dragged into covert operations quite early on in its history, I think. But intelligence agencies have always had, every intelligence agency to some extent, has always had covert action capability. It's just where it stands on that scale. Some are much more focused on intelligence gathering operations with a small covert action capability. Others have had, America being a good example, much larger and active covert action capabilities. But that does wax and wane over time. And the CIA, at the end of the Cold War, shifted away from covert action much more towards intelligence gathering. And then we had 9/11, and it moved much more again towards covert action, paramilitary operations, that sort of stuff. So you see the first people going to Afghanistan on the ground are not American troops, they're not even American special forces, they're CIA paramilitaries, are the first people, Americans, on the ground in Afghanistan after 9/11. So, and partly that's about politicians demanding intelligence agencies help them solve tricky problems that maybe formal diplomacy or even straight military action can't solve. Also, I'd say it's also some extent about intelligence agencies and their leaders being quite savvy at saying, where's the money? Where's the power? After 9/11, what do I need to do to make my agency really big and really powerful and accumulate loads of people? Well, I need to get in the covert action business because that's where it is. So to some extent, it's all about the accumulation of power as well. And how do you get a presidency here in the United States post 9/11? You need to be the covert action guys because that's who he's going to listen to. He's not going to listen to bean counters and analysts from Langley who are producing nice reports to him. It's like, find somebody who can kill Osama bin Laden for me. That's the sort of thing. So I think as well, it's an institutional issue as well to some extent.
So you think intelligence agencies became a lot more aggressive after 9/11?
Definitely the Americans did, yeah. I think there was, I think it's very hard to underestimate, I guess, the profound psychological shock to the American psyche from what happened in 9/11. I mean, you'd have to go back to Pearl Harbor in December 1941 for an attack on the American, and even then it wasn't the American mainland, it was obviously an American state, Hawaii, but slightly remote from the United States. But the shock of America being vulnerable for the first time, this notion of hemispheric security, Atlantic on one side, Pacific on the other, weak neighbors to the north, weak neighbors to the south, we are secure, our homeland is secure. That gets shattered in 1941 by the Japanese, and it gets shattered again by Al-Qaeda in 2001. So massive psychological impact, I think, and very difficult for any president, although we can criticize Bush, not to respond to that clamor for revenge effectively. I mean, it's quite a visceral, I think, emotion in America very early on in political commentators, the media, the wider population for, we want revenge for what's happened to us. So And the CIA just step into that vacuum, I think, and very quickly ramp up their paramilitary operations. But Afghanistan has never really ended. It's a graveyard of empires, isn't it? Afghanistan. It's never ended well for any intervention over history. And there are lots of mistakes made by ramping up any covert action program very quickly is always going to be fraught with problems and inefficiencies. And I think the Americans quite quickly got into all sorts of trouble in prosecuting an aggressive war on terror, not only practically, but also ethically and morally. And talk about intelligence blowback. Covert action often has lots of unintended negative consequences, which come back to bite people when people discover what it actually involves. I mean, waterboarding and Abu Ghraib in Iraq and all those sort of issues around an aggressive prosecution of a war which seems to transgress international norms and international law. And intelligence agencies always seem to be at the cutting edge of that process of where's the line in terms of legality and ethics and in terms of what's happened since 9/11 certainly.
But even from the start of like the CIA, they were doing like big, there was the example of a United Fruit Company that, they had a lot of land. They were growing a bunch of bananas. I think it was in Guatemala. And, and I think that the leader there did something where he was buying back land and giving it out to the farmers. And, that kind of pissed United Fruit Company off. And they did this propaganda campaign to the government to say, hey, this communist guy is taking over. And they do this coup, kick away the leader, and there's a new guy that comes in. And then that, I think they had a terrible history that came in after. But so, I mean, even from the jump, they were doing these, big covert action. And the interesting point that I find about that is that United Fruit Company, which is a company, a business, was able to somehow use the CIA to use government power to be able to do this coup. So now there's even a relationship between, capitalism, big companies who kind of run the world, and government power, which is quite interesting that I didn't think about before.
Yeah, I memean, politics follow the money. They always follow the money.
Right.
And I think America particularly, but also other nation states as well, politics is is about statecraft, but it's also about economics as well, and economic security. And absolutely Latin America. I mean, we can talk about, American imperialism and neo-imperialism in Latin America. It's always been regarded as America's backyard. And to some extent, going back to, the Monroe Doctrine and all the way back into the 19th century, America's always regarded Latin America as its own sort of personal fiefdom, really. So, and we can see that for Castro in Cuba when the Cuban Revolution happens in 1959 and repeated American attempts to overthrow Castro. It's almost like, and Latin America is ours. Economically, politically, we have to have hegemony over Latin America, and anything that interferes with that, we will challenge. And partly that's political, I think, in that American people really feel vulnerable to a Latin America that might not be directly beholden to America politically or economically. So you can see that developing in American politics, but also it's economics as well. So the fact that, and this was the same in Cuba with huge American sugar plantations in Cuba and a big American investment in the Cuban economy. Some of the pressure for the Eisenhower administration to intervene in Cuba after 1959 was economic. It was, we want to get this back because it's really important to us, not only strategically, but economically. And exactly the same in Guatemala. I mean, United Fruit is a big American company, big interest in Latin America, big banana plantations in Guatemala. Yeah, Jacobo Arbenz comes to power in Guatemala, but he's not communist. I don't think he's a socialist. And he wants to promote a more equal society and wants to institute land reform and wants to effectively compensate the United Fruit Company by taking back some of their huge holdings of land in Guatemala, but paying them to do so. So this wasn't appropriation. It's buying the land back at reasonably fair market prices. This wasn't somebody who's just appropriating land, and from that perspective, but that's too much for United Fruit. And they were quite, they effectively lobbied the Eisenhower administration to say you need to step in, and it becomes complex, doesn't it? Because then you get economic interests, multinational companies today who cage any intervention or encourage governments to intervene, whether it be in Latin America or Africa or elsewhere, in terms of politics and geostrategy, but often there's an economic undercurrent to that as well. I think that's certainly the case in Guatemala. It's partly about Eisenhower being genuinely worried that Guatemala might be shifting to the left politically, certainly not becoming communist, but might be shifting to the left, but also about big business in America putting pressure on his administration to act to protect them economically from having their assets appropriated in Guatemala. And so there's a genuine economic fear as well, I think. And the two combine quite powerfully. And you can see that all over. I mean, another example would be the Congo in the 1960s when the Belgians leave, and big mineral interests from the United States, but also from Western Europe, want to safeguard the Congo. So, intervention in those countries, both sort of mercenary intervention, but also government state interventions, are driven by economics, really. So a lot of that is economically driven. I think so there's a sort of both of them coming together in quite complex ways in Guatemala, I think, to justify that intervention. But as you said, it's a state-driven CIA operation that, again, is relatively successful in undermining a democratically elected government and removing them from power. But we talked about blowback. It has tremendously terrible legacies for South America. I mean, political repression, extremism, authoritarian rule, torture, erosion of civil rights, all of those little things spring from often interventions by larger states into the domestic politics and the sort of social web of those countries with disastrous consequences. So, we look today at some failed states and in Latin America, some of the problems they've got, and you can sort of, you can trace that back to some Western interventions, I think, that have been incredibly unhelpful. And certainly in Central America, that's been the case.
But what does global South intelligence look like other than India? Because you don't really hear a lot about it. And that's what's great about your work, is that you highlight that, India's and Pakistan's, their frameworks. But in a more broader scale, what does it look like? What is it in Africa and places you don't really hear about?
Yeah, you don't hear about it enough, and it's a really good point, and we should be talking about it a lot more. And I think, interestingly, we will. So in the coming years, as those states are becoming much more important on the global stage economically and just strategically, their intelligence services are becoming much more powerful. So we haven't really, the story of intelligence in the global South has never really been told. And it's a really interesting and fascinating story. And it is really important now, just in terms of modern geopolitics. And there have been really early examples. I mean, a good example in Africa is Ghana. When Ghana becomes independent in 1957, Ghana is an interesting case in point because it speaks to increasingly what's happening now, which is South Intelligence Corporation. So traditionally, states like India and Pakistan had reached out to the West and said, help us. But obviously they're wary of doing so because it carries neo-colonialist connotations, and they're a little bit worried about what's going to happen with that relationship. But Ghana takes a different route in 1957, and Kwame Nkrumah, quite early on, when Ghana's going to become, Gold Coast becomes independent, becomes Ghana. Nkrumah really knows the British are going to come to him and say, we'll help you set up an intelligence service. He knows the CIA are going to come to him and say, don't worry, we'll set up an intelligence service for you. And he doesn't want that because he knows he's going to be beholden to those services, and they'll exert some sort of control over Ghanaian security and intelligence. So he actually, interestingly, there's at that point, there are Commonwealth Prime Ministers conferences, really, where all the Commonwealth leaders get together. And at this point, they're always in London. There's one just before Ghana becomes independent, and Nkrumah goes up to Nehru at one of those conferences and says, help me set up an intelligence service. You've done this in India. You had nothing in 1947. I know you've used the British, but I want you to help me set up an intelligence. And I don't want you to send me British officers. I want you to send me Indian intelligence officers that you have trained, that have been part of your intelligence. Come to Ghana, send them to Ghana, help me set up a service. And Nehru says, fine, yeah, okay. And he sends two of what go on to be the most prominent and famous and well-known Indian intelligence officers. One's called R.N. Cow, and he goes on to be a really famous intelligence officer. He's seconded to Ghana. He goes out to Ghana in the 1950s, and they spend 4 or 5 years there setting up Ghana's first intelligence service. And Nkrumah is delighted by that because he thinks, well, at least I've got someone from the global South who's helping me. They're not going to have the same sort of issues around my independence. And that's a really successful example. And it goes on to be a really successful intelligence service. To some extent, it happens in post-apartheid South Africa. Cuba's really good at South-South cooperation as well. So Cuba's got, still to this day, actually, Cuba's got, I would say, one of the most effective intelligence services anywhere in the world. Cuban intelligence is brilliant, and it often penetrates the United States and was very effective at undermining all the plans by the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations to try and overthrow Castro. Castro's intelligence service was very effective at protecting that regime, was very good at penetrating the United States. So you used the Cuban exile community in Florida and elsewhere in the United States to run agents inside the American government. I mean, very recently, there was a Cuban agent who was an American ambassador. So this is a guy who got to the very top of the State Department, was an American ambassador to several Latin American countries. And for his entire career in American politics, he'd been a Cuban intelligence agent
Wow.
at the very top of the American government. And they had someone in the American, Ana Cortez, in the American Defense Intelligence Agency, again, senior individual, decades of experience, Cuban intelligence agent. So they penetrated the very heart of the American government. And they've been doing that for a very good intelligence agency. The Cubans always offered help to African intelligence agencies. They worked with Indian intelligence. They were very good at wanting to promote cooperation within the global South between intelligence agencies. And that's, again, a really interesting story that hasn't really been told. So lots of cooperation between the two. And I think that's going to grow. So India and other states now who've got quite large and effective intelligence agencies are using that as a tool of diplomacy. So sort of intelligence diplomacy, part of our offering to you is economic aid, is political support. Also, we can offer you some intelligence support as well. Would that be useful to you? So yeah, it's a really important part of diplomacy in the global South, I think, and a really important story that hasn't been told. And it's beginning to be, but there's a huge amount of work to be done on getting intelligence told in an African context, in a Latin American context, in an Asian context.
Oh, so it's nice to see there's some global South solidarity.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Right, but if we were to pit all these different intelligence agencies together, so CIA, Mossad, KGB, the MI6. Who's the best and what defines them? What's their unique styles?
It's a really difficult question. It's like asking what's your favorite music, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's different to everyone, isn't it? And I think it depends upon mission. So, for example, intelligence agencies have really interesting reputations, don't they? I think we talked about this just before we came on air, about the extent to which there's a mystique around intelligence agencies. And intelligence agencies are very careful about cultivating that mystique and that aura because it's really valuable for them. Not only institutionally, because it helps them within infights within governments. Like every government department's fighting for money and influence and power inside their own bureaucracy. And having that mystique helps intelligence agencies get more money from their treasuries, get political support from prime ministers and presidents. It's really important for them, I think, internally. But it's important externally as well because it helps them get this mystique around populations. And the CIA particularly has or had this mystique about being really feared and being omnipotent and all-powerful, particularly within the global South, off the back of coups in Guatemala and Iran, etc. And it cultivated that deliberately for a long period of time because it amplifies its power, beyond anything that's actually the case. It gives it an amplification of power. So I think that's really an important sort of point around that. But every intelligence agency has its ups and downs. So, for example, if we take Mossad, had a really important and effective early history where it was seen as quite effective in promoting or serving Israeli foreign policy, was very good at hunting down Nazis. Adolf Eichmann trial, for example, in Tel Aviv, when Mossad went to Argentina and kidnapped Adolf Eichmann and brought him back to Tel Aviv to stand trial. He's eventually executed. Really spectacular, high-profile media blitz operations that create global headlines across the world. And Mossad hunting down the perpetrators of the Munich massacres and Black September, and eliminating those individuals and making some mistakes along the way and killing innocent people, but being lauded or feted for these are dangerous guys. They're really effective. They know what they're doing. They're really hard-nosed killers and stuff. But then you see Israeli intelligence also suffers blunders. So it doesn't predict, for example, Egypt's attack on Israel in 1973. Much more recently with the Hezbollah attack and Hamas attacks on Israel, it doesn't predict them. And it's a massive intelligence failure, or regarded in Israel as a massive intelligence failure. So every intelligence service, I guess, has moments where it wants to laud its successes, but they all have quite major failures in their history. I mean, Britain, it promotes the idea of James Bond and uses media and stuff. But then you look at the Cambridge Five or KGB running agents, the heart of the British establishment, Kim Philby and Guy Burgess and Donald McLean, all senior members of SIS and the British Foreign Office, who were Soviet agents for at the heart of the British establishment. So every intelligence service, I think, has its sort of successes and has its failures, and that's inevitable. If you think of a politician, it's all it's ups and downs. One day you're a hero, the next day you're a villain. Over any protracted period of time, that's going to happen. I think again, it's about mission. So, for example, Mossad is very focused on a limited geographic mission for most of its history. The CIA is a global intelligence agency. The KGB were global intelligence agencies. SIS, British MI6, claimed to be a global intelligence agency. Its footprint was relatively small. I mean, stations were quite small. Global, I guess, in terms of reach, but certainly not in terms of power, in terms of what it could do. So having different intelligence agencies that perform different tasks is important. And it does shift over time. I mean, India's a good example. India, until relatively recently, had developed an intelligence culture on intelligence agencies from 1947 until maybe the last 10 years that were really focused on the Indian South Asian region. So they were focused on India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, maybe Burma, some operations into southern China, and that was it. Quite localized in terms of its intelligence footprint. And then India starts becoming a global power. And economically and politically, it starts becoming a bit of a superpower, and its military starts growing, and it starts having interests on a global scale for the first time, embraces globalization in the 1990s, and now we see the Indian economy is huge. So it has global footprints. So then it starts going after people in Canada and people in the United States. And just recently, scandals over India in his research analysis wing in his external intelligence agency being implicated in the assassination or attempted assassination of Indian nationals in Vancouver and in Manhattan and elsewhere, some in the UK. So then it starts becoming a global intelligence agency with a global reach. And partly that's, I think, about Indian states saying, we're one of the big players now. We're not only economically and politically, but also strategically in terms of intelligence. So that profile, I guess what I'm saying is dynamic, it's not static, it changes. Some intelligence agencies, you could argue Britain's become a smaller intelligence player because, I mentioned MI5 withdrawing from India in the 1960s. Sometimes they contract under financial pressures and manpower pressures and become smaller intelligence operators. And sometimes in India's case, they're actually growing and expanding. So
you see the murder in Canada.
Yep.
So the suppression of the Khalistan movement, was that related back to India intelligence or?
Yeah, so there's quite a strong line of evidence. So that's quite a controversial case. So one individual was killed in Vancouver, where there's a big diasporic Indian community which are derived from the Punjab, and they're part of the Sikh faith, and they're campaigning for what's called Khalistan, which is an independent Punjabi state in India, and have been doing so really since the 1970s. But at various points that came in. It was big in the 1980s. It died down again. It's become much more prominent recently. And the Modi government in India has really begun to target those diasporic communities in London, in Canada particularly, but also in the United States, who are gaining lots of media headlines, and they don't like the fact they're promoting this idea of an independent Punjab state. And India's intelligence service, research analysis wing, its external intelligence service, there's quite strong evidence that they were implicated in hiring. Interestingly, again, developments in intelligence, often intelligence agencies now, Putin's Russia do this quite a lot. They hire out contract killing to local gangsters, local mobsters. So it's not necessarily an intelligence agent of a national service that pulls the trigger. Often they're hiring underworld figures or local criminals to perform, subcontracting the work out for them to do that sort of stuff. So Putin's done that in Europe quite extensively, using the GRU to do that sort of stuff. It appears as though the research analysis wing were involved in some form with sort of local Indian gangsters in Canada and the United States who were hired by Indian intelligence officers to effectively assassinate these Khalistani activists. There's quite a strong intelligence trail back. Controversial because some of that is from signals intelligence, so intercepted communications from Indian consulates and embassies abroad, which was going back to New Delhi, which seemed to indicate Indian state involvement in those operations. It's been a big furore. I mean, Justin Trudeau stood up in the Canadian Parliament effectively and said, "We know you've done this." So it created a big diplomatic scandal, and diplomats were sent home, expelled from Canada. India then expelled Canadian diplomats from New Delhi. So a big tit for tat expulsion of diplomats. So the blowback on that has been enormous, interestingly.
But Modi sort of just washed his hands off of it and said, listen, this has nothing to do with me. Trudeau, you're crazy. Why are you blaming me? And I think that's the issue with sort of these stories when they're related to intelligence agencies. It's always easy to tread into very conspiratorial waters, and you're not sure what's true, what's not. This is linked to that, that's linked to that.
That's a little bit the whole point of it, really.
Yeah, and it's hard to decipher.
It is sometimes difficult to unravel fact from fiction, and it does become a bit conspiratorial. And I think that's happened in lots of cases. Like, who killed Kennedy and the conspiracies around that, and it's the CIA and stuff. So I think intelligence agencies are often accused of lots of things they don't actually do. It's not that they don't do lots of things which are unsavory and unpleasant and unethical, maybe sometimes, but they're accused of everything and things they don't do. So that conspiracism, I think, does gain traction. I think in the case of Canada and Khalistan particularly, and also an attempted assassination in New York, in Manhattan, I think there's really strong evidence on the part of the Canadian government. I mean, I guess to put it in perspective, would Justin Trudeau have stood up in the Canadian Parliament and basically called out India for trying to assassinate a Canadian national on Canadian soil unless he was pretty convinced he had compelling evidence? The problem with intelligence evidence is often it's very difficult to make public. So some of that evidence, I think, was from local human sources. The most compelling evidence was from signals intelligence that came from a Five Eyes partner, Five Eyes intelligence being Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, United Kingdom, who operate as a cartel of 5 states who share intelligence and often share signals intelligence together as a sort of core component of that. That's a sort of circle of trust, really. So they share intelligence on a basis that this will never be made public. So the theory is the United States National Security Agency intercepted these communications. They shared them with the Canadian government and said, this is what's happened. Trudeau then goes public, but he can't actually release those intercepts because they're American intercepts and has got the ability to release them. So Trudeau is basically saying, I know you've done this because I've got the evidence, but quite difficult for him to make that public. Although in the court case in New York, there's an attempted assassination of a Canadian national in New York, which again linked back to Indian intelligence. The district attorney in New York has filed a case, and a lot of those documents have been released publicly, and they do create quite a damning paper trail back to Indian nationals who are directly linked to Indian intelligence services. So it's not a smoking gun because it's very difficult to provide a smoking gun, but this guy's in court in the United States. The Americans think they've got a really good chance of convicting him for an assassination, attempted murder. And there's quite compelling documentary evidence that the Indian state was involved. But of course, Modi is not going to stand up. No, it's the classic line, we never confirm or deny any intelligence activity. Every state government says that. They're not going to do that. But I think within the intelligence world, the consensus is absolutely the Indian state was responsible or behind those. And again, when you come to states, it's really difficult. So although the Indian state and the Indian intelligence services may be behind, who exactly, was it Modi who said that? Or was it someone 2 steps down from Modi? Was it Amit Shah, who's the Indian Home Minister, who seems to be involved in this? Was he the one who gave the order? So knowing exactly, I mean, it's the American presidential thing, isn't it? American presidents don't ever put this down on paper. If they're going to say, Kennedy says assassinate Castro, he's not going to say, I give you authority to assassinate Castro and sign the memo. It's going to be a verbal order that's given to someone. So there are ways of covering your tracks, I think, and having plausible deniability for presidents to move away from intelligence actions when they go wrong and there's blowback associated with them. But yeah, it's a complex issue, the attempted assassinations.
So what are your thoughts on Trump's administration releasing Kennedy documents and this whole trend of releasing intelligence documents, which is something that we haven't really seen before?
Yeah, there are 2 strands that I think. So Trump has released, one of the things he's done, I think when he was campaigning ironically on the basis of transparency in terms of intelligence. So Trump has a really conflicted and complicated relationship with American intelligence, I think. Sort of akin to the relationship Richard Nixon had in the 1970s. Nixon hated the CIA and was paranoid that they had conspired against him. He lost a really narrow election to John F. Kennedy at the beginning of the 1960s, 1960. And Nixon was convinced he lost that election because the CIA didn't release information on a so-called missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union that would enable him to win that election. So he blamed the CIA for losing the election to Kennedy in 1960 and never forgave the CIA. So when he came to power in the 1970s, late 1969, he basically launched a vendetta against the CIA, sacked loads of staff, run them down, publicly criticised them. There was really went after the CIA. And Trump, to a certain extent, I think, has that notion that the CIA are all Ivy League liberals. They're not MAGA. They're not behind him. They need to be partial. They need to get with the program, and they're not. And I think he has this notion that they're really people who can't be trusted to implement his program. So that this notion that intelligence should be politically neutral. Trump's perspective is it shouldn't. It should serve the president. It should be very sort of partial in that.
So there was also with the FBI. Yep. He has a really relationship with the FBI because with the whole Hunter Biden laptop situation, which was, we could argue, election interference, where you had the FBI calling this, Russian election interference, when they had the laptop, and then after the election, it turns out it was completely authentic.
Yep.
So Trump is saying, well, hold on, you were clearly against me.
Yep.
And he was even also kind of on the campaign trail saying, yeah, FBI, we need to cut everything, shut it down, restart it.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's politicization of intelligence. Again, it's a president using executive authority. And again, remember, the FBI and the CIA are executive organs. They're not controlled by Congress, so the Congress has oversight responsibilities for them. The president has huge amounts of power to hire and fire FBI directors and CIA directors. Has huge power over the intelligence apparatus and bureaucracy in the American system. And Trump, I think, has always been cottoned onto that. So this can be a really powerful tool for me. I can use this really, but only if I have people in those positions who are not going to be politically neutral, are going to be loyal to me, are going to do what I tell them to do. So effectively, he's gone through and starts he's gutting the FBI, he's gutting the CIA, he's removing in officers he doesn't think are going to be loyal to him, and putting partial individuals in place who are focused on Trump as an individual and his administration, rather than on American national security per se and America's wider interests, I think. But it is it's a difficult time for intelligence agencies, I think. And there is a sense that he's really running down the professional competency of intelligence agencies by removing so many experienced and knowledgeable staff so quickly. How do you fill that void? How do you continue to function as an effective intelligence services when whole departments are being shut down, people are being removed from their jobs? It's a really difficult sort of situation at a time when America's facing from Russia in terms of electoral interference, but also elsewhere globally, and also from China, and China mounting significant intelligence operations in the United States over the last decade or so. How do you protect yourself as a state against those internal and external threats when you haven't really got an effective intelligence service? And not only that, when your intelligence services are at war, they're fighting the White House, they're fighting internally, they're focused really on survival rather than their core mission of upholding American national security. So it's a really difficult time, I think, for the American national security establishment. They don't really know, I think, how to respond to Trump, but he has a huge amount of power to influence what happens there. So it's difficult to see how they push back or how they contest that. It's very difficult for them to do so.
And then I wonder if we could get your thoughts. Another thing that was supposed to be released that he campaigned on are the Epstein files.
Oh, yeah.
And they were supposed to be released. They didn't get released.
Yeah.
We talk about establishment. And then, so a lot of people say that Epstein was a Mossad agent, and that whole thing that was going on was an actual intelligence operation. What are your thoughts?
So again, it goes back to conspiracism, I think. I mean, interestingly, Trump, the Epstein files, but also the Kennedy assassination files became a big thing for him. So he actually just a couple of weeks ago did release another big batch of files related to the Kennedy assassination, and people are pouring through, historians are pouring through them now. There's actually not a lot new in them. It's, a lot of this stuff is
quite performative.
Yeah, it's performative, and it's stuff that just adds a little bit more granular details to stuff that's already been, but it's not changing the needle. We're not going to find out a new person assassinated Kennedy. We're not going to find out tremendous insights into American foreign policy that we don't already know. We may discover some granular detail. There might be some sort of titillation in there. There might be some interesting stuff, a bit of sensational stuff, but nothing really.
Maybe that's why they
substance.
Released it.
But yeah, I think partly that's to do with, again, I think when we get conspiracism as well, there are two elements here. I think one, people like conspiracism because it's an easy answer to complex questions, like, could Oswald have killed Kennedy on his own? Of course he couldn't, because it's a simple, straightforward explanation. So let's find 100 different other reasons why the Cubans were involved and Mossad was involved and who else was involved in that assassination. It's, people like to have that sense of mystery around it, I think. Often it's a much more mundane explanation, I think. I don't think there's been no evidence that I've seen, and certainly hasn't come out, the latest release that changes the dial on the fact that Oswald was the killer and stuff like that. And it's the same with Epstein, I think. This notion that has to be associated with intelligence services and they have to be behind that sort of stuff. I mean, I've seen no strong evidence that just isn't smoke and mirrors and sort of, conspiracism around it, which does gain, popular traction. But politicians, do exploit it. And Trump's very adept at tapping into things which he knows that might sort of trigger something in the American sort of political psyche that's going to be useful for him, I think. So the Kennedy files, I think, are, case in point. They're really insubstantial. I mean, there's nothing of substance in those files, but he's made it into a big thing about releasing and overcoming the power of a state to hold back records and stuff. I think a lot of the reasons those records don't get released is just bureaucratic inertia. We often underestimate the fact that bureaucracies are just really inefficient and they're just really poor at releasing documents. And often, sometimes it's because there is a big secret to hide, but very rarely. Often it's just because they're not getting around to that sort of stuff. So occasionally you will get quite important. And there's a big, I think, Britain is probably a good example of this, when the British Foreign Office declared that they didn't have lots of files that were left over from the period of decolonisation, particularly related to Kenya and atrocities committed by colonial administrations in Kenya in the sort of lead up to Kenyan independence. Claimed those files didn't exist, and then we found they did exist. And there was a big secret archive at a place called Hounslow Park in North London, and those archives were found, and they did shed a huge amount of light on what happened during British decolonisation, and changed the needle slightly because it was able to be presented quite conclusively as a much more brutal, much more violent, much more coercive process than popular imagination sort of led to believe. This narrative of Britain was really good at decolonising. Well, turns out they weren't really. And lots of Kenyans were able to use that and take the British government to court and win substantial damages for what happened to them and their families during that process. Extrajudicial killings, detention, brutal torture, that sort of stuff. And you can understand why the British government probably wouldn't want to release that information. So occasionally it happens, and occasionally those notions that there is something to hide here is validated, but rarely, I think. I mean, and certainly not when it will come to sensational things like Epstein and things. And I think a lot of that is conspiracism that feeds into this sense of sensationalism.
But it becomes kind of difficult when looking into intelligence, because the line becomes blurry between conspiracy and intelligence. And I would even think probably that the intelligence companies or agencies probably are throwing in some of those conspiracies to even keep us confused,
Undoubtedly, disinformation and misinformation is a tool. I mean, intelligence agencies use those and have used those throughout their histories against adversaries. So, and this has happened in we now know from the sort of Church and Pike inquiries in the United States and the CIA in the 1970s that the CIA was mounting those type of operations against the American public. So intelligence agencies, when they get slightly out of control, do those sort of things, I think. But yeah, a lot of the sort of conspiracism around that is just that, it's conspiracism. So there's a sort of limited sense in which I think that's really making a big impact on changing the political dial around that sort of stuff.
What about China? Because I was watching a clip from, what's his name? Do you know Andrew Bustami?
Oh, yeah.
But he was saying what actually makes China so powerful was their massive diaspora.
Yep.
And that maybe it's a bit of a crude generalization, but you're saying that a Chinese in America, they're still Chinese. They still associate themselves with being Chinese. Whereas an American or a Brit, they sort of adopt the host nation's identity. So what has been like their rise and their capabilities, and is there a chance that they could overtake the States? Or
so Chinese intelligence is incredibly powerful. It's always been very powerful domestically, but it's become much more internationally prominent, I think, over the last couple of decades. And there's a long history of intelligence agencies using diasporic populations quite effectively as a sort of amplifying tool for their interests, and both coercively and non-coercively. So I guess the non-coercive element to some extent would be Israel's Mossad, which has used diasporic Jewish populations in various countries around the world to facilitate its operations. So using local Jewish populations as a sort of third hidden force within countries, to even as simply as running safe houses or providing food and shelter or information to Mossad. So using the sort of diasporic Jewish populations quite effectively as a tool to amplify its intelligence footprint. And more coercively in the case of China, I think that's absolutely true. So the MSS, Ministry of State Security, which is China's sort of premier intelligence agency, has certainly grown in power, both domestically in China. So it does have a domestic component to it, but it's mainly focusing externally to China. Has become much more in power. Again, similar to India, as China's economic power has grown, and it's become much more focused on defending Chinese interests economically and politically in a global sense rather than a regional sense. A lot of that surrounded economic espionage, interestingly. So the MSS has been very focused on Silicon Valley in California, on acquiring blueprints for high technology, chip design in Taiwan, acquiring all that sort of high-tech data research and development sort of information that America has and China hasn't. So how do we catch up quick? Again, it sort of goes back, I guess, to the Soviet Union, maybe in the 1920s and 30s. How do we catch up and industrialize and catch up with the West really quickly? Well, let's steal their secrets. Let's use espionage. China's doing the same. How do we catch up with America and beat them? You look at the latest American stealth jet fighter, and then you look at the variant that China's brought in 2 or 3 years later. They're almost identical. Now, that may be coincidence, or it's probably because a lot of those jet designs have been acquired by the MSS through various means, both through cyber, but also by traditional espionage. So there's a huge amount of military and industrial commercial espionage being mounted by MSS. And to some extent, they do use Chinese citizens. I think that's absolutely right. They are very keen at coercing Chinese citizens, if need be, persuading them, if possible, to do the bidding of the Chinese state. So there are lots of sort of, precisely what scale that operates is difficult to tell. But there's lots of anecdotal evidence that, all levels of Chinese society abroad have had some contact from the MSS and who tried to co-opt them to make their sort of life easier particularly in terms of economic espionage, but also in terms of monitoring dissidents abroad, monitoring Uyghurs, monitoring Tibetans, monitoring dissident groups abroad that might be deemed as problematic or subversive in terms of how the Chinese state reacts to them. So I think they are quite adept at managing that diasporic population, both not only in Asia, but also in the United States, in Europe and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, there was something that was big in France where the government started asking, hey, why are all these guys that are working in nuclear power plants married to Chinese women? And then they're like, hey, what's going on? And it turns out it was a bunch of, China was sending a very beautiful looking women that turned out to be spies.
Yeah, I know that honey trap thing where, both attractive men and attractive women are used as a means of sort of luring people to get into relationships which they're then compromised or they acquire data from. Yeah, again, a very tried and tested sort of espionage technique. And, both the West has used it to a lesser extent, but it's, been used by China, by Russia quite extensively in the past as a means of acquiring that sort of information. So yeah, unsurprising that particularly in fields of high technology, nuclear power, defense industries, China's desperate to get access to the latest Western information on those sort of areas. And you can see the way it's transformed the Chinese economy. That's been quite pivotal in certain sectors of really allowing China to jump 5, 10, 15 years ahead than it otherwise would have done and save huge amounts of research and development costs because it has access to that information that's, from Western sources, both in Western Europe, but also in the United States particularly. And it's a really big focus of MSS activity, I think. And probably the biggest focus over the last 10 or 15 years has been economic and commercial espionage.
But it's interesting when you ask the question about what are the, most powerful, agencies. You said CIA, MI6, KGB, but you didn't mention China. And I think that's interesting because no one really thinks of China Secret Service. It's not really at the top of our minds.
No, I think it's been mostly internal until, and I'm talking 20, 30 years, the MSS has been very active globally. But I think initially it was either a regional or domestic intelligence service. And as China's economic power has grown maybe since the late 1980s, it's become much more expansive in its global footprint. So compared to the CIA, which it really was a global organization from the late 1940s. China is relatively, and India relatively recently become global intelligence organizations. But it's also a component, I think, of the type of operations they specialize in and their priorities and how public they can become. So, for example, China's, I think, specialized industrial espionage, and lots of Chinese agents have been arrested in the United States and put on trial recently. But it's not sensational. Most people are like, it's economic espionage. Well, you stole some secret. It's not a big headline grabbing thing, although it's really important. But if you assassinate someone, that's a big thing and it's sensational on people. So, I mean, France's external intelligence agency for a long time prioritized commercial intelligence. They also had a sort of sideline, quite an aggressive sideline in covert action. But a lot of their focus by the French government is, we want you to spy, but we're not that interested in political information. We want commercial information. So go out there and steal secrets that can enable the French economy, the nuclear industry, military aviation, that sort of stuff. That's what we want. We want blueprints. We want that sort of stuff. So France really focused on that for a considerable number of years. Britain's never been that. I mean, every intelligence agency engages in commercial espionage, but it wasn't really Britain's thing. It was much more political and that sort of stuff. So yeah, different agencies have different priorities, and sometimes that brings them to public attention much more. Commercial, I think, espionage has never been that sexy, so people don't really, for even when it's exposed, and it has been repeatedly in the United States. I think one of the frustrations of the American government is it's not gaining public traction on what the Chinese are doing. So the Chinese have been repeatedly caught and individuals taken to court in the United States and prosecuted and imprisoned. And it just doesn't really resonate with American people. It's like, well, whatever. It's not really an interesting story to them. Where the big assassination thing with India gained huge amounts more traction than like 10, 20, 30 Chinese espionage cases. So the FBI is definitely trying to, the FBI is sort of focusing on Chinese espionage in the United States, desperately trying to use a public education thing. And we mentioned public education is really important. The FBI is trying to get the American people to wake up to this, and they're promoting it quite aggressively on social media and elsewhere, but it's not really gaining huge amounts of traction.
I mean, even I remember the Saudi journalist, like in Saudi when the journalist got killed.
Yeah.
That got global attention. I think that was probably intelligence thing.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned France. How did France intelligence have action in Africa? Because we hear about all these coups that happened. Did they, how involved were they?
So, yeah, it's difficult to tell really because they're, again, very secretive. I mean, one of the big issues about intelligence, and we sort of touched on that, is it's very difficult to unravel fact from fiction. And to a certain extent, intelligence agencies cultivate that, A, to hide what they're actually doing, but B, to create mystique as well. I mean, I think one of the biggest ways intelligence agencies could help themselves, ironically, is to be more open and more transparent. So I think there's a lot they could do. So there's always a debate between intelligence agencies saying, we can't tell you this because if we did, it would imperil people who work for us. We would undermine our national security would be threatened. You would be less safe. That's the sort of thing. I think that line, that line exists clearly. But I think intelligence agencies often hide behind it. So they could go a lot further with telling us, this is how we operate, this is what we do, without really imperiling what they call sources and methods or individual agents, or without relaying to us information that would be damaging to either individuals or national security. I think they can go a lot further with that. But they choose not to, I think, for various sort of reasons around mystique and awe and things like that. But it does make it very difficult to trust intelligence agencies, so there's a lack of transparency. I mean, what does the average British person know about MI6? Very, very, very little. MI6 has never released a single one of its files. They know through James Bond, which MI6 love because it cultivates the image of successful British intelligence. Bond always wins. Bond's, he always gets what he wants. He's always successful. This notion of MI6 officers looking like James Bond, complete nonsense. But it creates that sort of image around them. And lots of ex-heads of MI6 have said he's the best recruiting agent MI6 have ever had, because people see James Bond and they think, oh, that's what it's like. It's not obviously not like that at all, but it resonates with the public, I think. So there is this lack of transparency, partly by design and partly, I think, because it's just politically and bureaucratically convenient for them to do so. But it does mean we lack transparency. And we need transparency in a democracy because ultimately intelligence agencies work for us. They work for you. They work for me. They work for the people, ultimately. So, we don't want intelligence agencies which we feel haven't got great oversight. So in the UK, we do have oversight, have parliamentary oversight, but still, it's limited what we're told about, what we learn about intelligence. And interesting, what we tend to learn about, unfortunately for intelligence agencies, failure. When it goes wrong, when there's a big disaster, when someone takes into the European Court of Human Rights for infringing then we hear about this sort of stuff and it gets released judicially. I think intelligence agencies could be a bit more proactive in telling us both sides of the story. So that narrative is not helpful. In terms of France, it's really difficult. France is a very secretive culture. When it comes to intelligence, they don't release files. They're not very open. They don't engage with the public. Their public engagement is really poor. So it's difficult to know exactly what they're doing. And I think we probably could know a lot more about what they're doing, really. I mean, the current head of MI6 is on Twitter, so he goes on Twitter a bit and stuff, Richard Moore. But, it's like happy spy day. I mean, there's nothing of substance there. So it's just like, so there's this public engagement and MI6 is saying, we are engaging more with the public. We've got a website, but there's nothing on it. We're on Twitter, but you're not saying anything. So I think, I think they're sort of trying to project an image of transparency and openness, but I think they could probably go a lot further. And in democracy, it's probably we should sort of be demanding more in
Yeah.
terms of that balance. And there's always a balance. There's always things we shouldn't be told for obvious reasons of safety and security. There's probably a lot more we can be told, I think. I mean, for example, the fact that SIS, MI6, have not released their record, any record, even one going back to 1909 when they were formed, is ludicrous. What can they tell us from 1912 that's going to be a state secret that's going to blow up the world if we know about it now? Well, nothing. But, it's this notion of, well, if we give you one file, you'll want more and more and more and more. And we don't want to open the door to that sort of thing. But, we're a democracy, aren't we? So we have a right to know, don't we?
Yeah.
So I think that balance needs to be sort of addressed a bit more.
But I think it's interesting that there is even this balance. You mentioned that these intelligence agencies work for us.
Yep.
But there is this balance that people are becoming more and more on edge about these intelligence agencies spying on us. And even, with the Snowden thing that happened in America, like now people are more on edge. I was seeing recently the new Amazon Alexa.
Oh, yeah.
Now the whatever recordings you have or it listens, it goes straight to the Amazon servers. And in my head, I'm just like, yeah, agencies are going to be all over that,
Well, interestingly, it does throw out the sort of philosophical question: who are the big intelligence agencies now? And you could argue, is it the CIA? Is it the MSS? Is it Mossad? Or actually, is it Amazon? Is it Google? Who know more information probably about you and me than MI6 will ever know. I mean, if they know your shopping history, the verbal commands you've given to Alexa and other things, if they have all that information on the cloud now, then maybe the big intelligence agencies of the future, or even now, are Sainsbury's and Tesco's and Google and Amazon and all these people that have huge repositories of data and are using AI to predict what we're doing. And we go online and an advert appears because we've done something else that's trying to tap into our psyche. It says, we think you're going to want to buy that. They're reading our minds, predicting our behavior in ways that are probably light years ahead of what intelligence agencies are doing on that scale. So I think there is a sense in which the technology, AI, cloud computing, machine learning is changing the dynamic of intelligence. And I think as well, that's probably going to mean that as we move forward, traditional intelligence agencies are not going to be the way they are now for much longer. So they're going to have to rely on private companies. So if you realize that AI is going to be really important and machine learning and you're an average MI6 person, you're not going to know about that. But someone in the private sector who's a 20-year-old computer programming expert is a bit of a they will know about that. And they're the people you need to go to get that information to make it work for you. So I think, there's going to be a lot more partnership, public-private partnership, where state intelligence agencies are going to need to draw on technical expertise, capacity in terms of manpower, to drive forward intelligence. And it's going to be a much more electronic sort of digital world in which, that intelligence is being used in sort of, creative ways, which traditional intelligence services just aren't very good at doing.
So do you think sort of human spies could become obsolete?
So that's a really good debate. And it's another philosophical debate between intelligence agencies. So and it's involved, actually, interestingly, former heads of British intelligence and quite former heads of Central Intelligence Agency who've come out at various points in the CIA's history and said, technological developments mean actually we don't need human intelligence anymore. I don't think human intelligence, I take a sort of middle position on this. I don't think you're ever going to not need human intelligence. I think the extent to which we're using human intelligence is probably going to degrade slightly over time, just because of the technological capabilities we have, which we never had before. Predictive behavior because of how you use your phone, your computers, CCTV surveillance, your every move being monitored in London. That's going to be useful technologically and create a picture which is completely new, I think, and is evolving all the time. But still, you're going to be in a situation where someone is saying something to someone else in a room where you haven't got a microphone and you haven't got a television camera and you haven't got a laptop. And that is a really important information. So I think the human dimension is really important in terms of there will be information you can't access electronically, but also perception as well. So even if you get that information, if you don't know and you've never met and you're not intimate with, in sort of a psychological sense, someone like Vladimir Putin, even if you get the transcript of what he's been saying in a meeting, how do you decode that? Because if you can't see his body language, if you can't see his smiling when he's making that comment, or he's frowning when he's making that comment, if you've just got the digital transcript or even a voice recording of that, if you can't see how he's moving or what he's doing, how do you really decode that? So sometimes you need that body language, you need to be there, you need someone telling you, I know this person, this is what he means by that statement, and it's not what you think he means just by reading that transcript. He actually means the opposite of that. So I think there are elements of human psychology that are never going to be replaced by technology. So you're always going to have some human asset, I think, which is really important. And just technology fails sometimes. And one of the classic examples that's always put forward is the Iranian Revolution, where the American embassy was stormed into Iran. And young Iranian students took hold of and took hostage members of the American embassy. And America had spy satellites all over Tehran, and it had cameras in the streets, and it had audio equipment, but it could not get into the room. Those hostages were being held, and it meant they were never rescued. Or the rescue attempt was made, it was a disaster. Eagle Claw, it didn't work. But they were unable, CIA kept being told by the president, rescue those hostages. We can't, because we don't know where they are. We don't know how they're being kept. We don't know how many people are with them. We have no information on what's going on. What they needed was someone in that room to tell them, this is where they're being held. This is where the exit door is. These are the number of guns in that room. And the only way you do that was a human agent, but they just didn't have one. So sometimes you're going to need that person in the room, I think, always. But I think the number of times you're going to need that is because other means of sort of degrading it. So it's a great debate, and lots of intelligence people stand polarized on that debate, I think, in terms of sort of technologists that say, no, this is the way that things are going is technology, and other people are saying, well, you'll always need human assets. I think it's both, really.
So, and in your research, a lot of it involved speaking to sort of people within these bodies. What was your experience like?
Yeah, I think it's really good to do so. And I think one of the things I was trying to make about public engagement is demystifying. So I think there are reasons why intelligence agencies want to maintain a mystique, but there's always really good reasons for saying we need to understand they're just average people. They're not James Bond. They're not Jason Bourne. They're just average people who are trying to do a really important job, and they're under tremendous stress, and they're in lots of danger often. And it's really useful to understand just what they are, that they also get unsure. They're also stressed. They're just like us in terms of their work life. So to sort of get to know them, I think, is really important, because it also helps you to understand why things go wrong, because ultimately they're humans. And I think, again, we attach this sort of we all CIA, you should get everything right. But actually it's just this human frailty and sort of fallacies that sometimes make that happen. So I think it's useful to get to know those people. It's also useful, I think, from a recruiting perspective as well, to let people know what these individuals are really like, that they're just, I'm not saying reveal the identities of these individuals, but to know something about the type of people that join those organizations, to make them more diverse. I mean, one of the big issues, post 9/11, and a shift in the intelligence focus away from sort of the end of the Cold War period, where everyone had to learn Russian and you were, European based, and that was your thing, to the point where, well, do you know Pashto? Do you know Kurdish? Do you know how they're the language skills we now need? Have you got them? Well, no one in the intelligence services had those. Do you know about the culture on the ground in Karachi? I don't think you do. Do you know about how people move and the way they move and how society operates? Because that's what we need to know now. So having a really diverse and something that represents your culture, and not only externally, but internally. How many intelligence agencies or SIS are British Muslims? I don't know. Well, I would bet very few. So, if you're not representative of your own society and culture, then can you really do your job effectively, I think? So thinking about it in terms of, we need to make sure that this is an organization or a national security architecture that feels open to everyone, because they're our organizations, they're our services. They protect us and look after us. That's their job. So they need to represent us, not just in terms of nominally, but also in terms of, they need to be diverse in terms of gender, in terms of, ethnicity, completely diverse, because then they'll be much better. It's the argument for policing, I guess, isn't it? If you don't have a diverse police force, then how do you police for consent? How do you do that? I think there are issues around there that they need to sort of open up to make sure they really reflect society, and then the argument would be they would become more effective, and certainly sort of win public trust a bit more if they were that way inclined, I think.
But it's interesting you say that these agents aren't these James Bond figure, and they're quite normal people.
Not the ones I've met, anyway.
Maybe that makes them good agents because, they can fit in and such. But do you find any characteristics within these people that make them good agents? Like, was there anything surprising when speaking to them?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So you've got the James Bond on one side. I'd say there's also the antithesis to that. So, and you get that in any intelligence. I'm talking about popular culture. So like George Smiley and John le Carre would be the antithesis, like an old, fat, middle-aged white guy who like is the hero of John le Carre's MI6 novels. Absolutely the polar opposite of James Bond. But he's like, this is what, the idea being you need to be a real thinker. You need to be cool under pressure. You're not someone who's going to run around and kill people and stuff like that. That's just not the way it works. I think, MI6 are looking, they just spend a lot of time looking for certain personality profiles who are going to be resilient, are going to be analytical, are going to be able to cope with stress well, are not going to panic. People who can demonstrate the sort of attributes that they think they're going to need in a hostile environment in which they might find themselves. But again, within an intelligence organization, I guess that's one of the pleas I'm making for diversity, I guess. It's a broad church. So like the CIA, you have analysts. Well, analysts don't need to be paramilitary types. They need to be people that are cool, are logical, have great attention and focus, are willing to read piles and piles and piles of documents, searching for a sort of grain of truth within them. So they need to be very analytical and very sort of detail focused. You might have a paramilitary operator in the same organization that's absolutely the opposite, much more gung-ho, much more, and they both have their place in that organization. There are people in between. So they're sort of broad churches. I don't think there's any one individual that might be regarded as a type in intelligence, because intelligence is like any organization, like in SOAS. You'll have people that, are great lecturers, and you'll have people that man the library, and they have to, everyone has a different skill set. So, and I think that's the same in intelligence. I think we seem to think everyone is James Bond. Well, intelligence agencies aren't like that, because they have different, they have, I guess if we're going back to James Bond, I don't really want to go back to James Bond, but if we are, Q, the quartermaster, the techie guy in James Bond, there is a technical service element to MI6, so they have their own technical people that work on that sort of stuff and develop gadgets and things like that. So, you've got different sort of people in different roles, really. It's difficult to generalize, I think, with those sort of things.
And being so immersed in the world of intelligence, how has it shaped you?
I think the thing is try not to be too sort of cynical about it. I think I feel a bit conflicted about it, because I come from sort of a background that's quite strong on civil liberties and and that sort of things, and so it's complicated my feelings about it, I think, in interesting ways, which is great because you get to think about it critically. But it's like, where is that line drawn? So I think constantly intelligence, and I think having spoken to intelligence officers, they go through the same sort of dilemmas. When do we act, and when is that ethical, and when does it become not ethical? When is what we do justified, and when is it not justified? Where is that line drawn? And so there are quite strong guidelines now that are written down for MI5 and MI6, telling their officers how to act, and what is acceptable and not acceptable. But inevitably, they get put in situations where they're having to make snap judgments, they're having to make calls on those things, and it comes down to, I guess, an individual's perception of what's right and what's wrong. If I do this, am I going to save 10 lives? But is it something I really don't want to do unless I absolutely have to? Because I think it's going to have a consequence elsewhere that's not great. So I think those moral dilemmas, and just understanding how difficult it is to do the job, not thinking they are all gung-ho, James Bond, completely callous, don't care, go home, forget about everything, kill 4 people and wake up the next morning and everything's fine. Understanding that it's actually a really difficult, often dangerous, incredibly stressful, ethically challenging job to do. So, really, really difficult. So having sort of respect for that and how difficult the decisions they have to make are. And I'm not being an apologist for any intelligence service anywhere in the world, because intelligence services historically have got things terribly wrong on occasions. We talked about Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib and waterboarding and all those sort of things where, lots of people felt, this has crossed the line that's inappropriate. Some people will defend it, but there are real issues around sort of ethics around that sort of stuff. But I guess just understanding that when you talk to most of those people in intelligence services, they are genuinely decent people who are trying to do a really difficult job as well as they possibly can, and having sort of empathy and sympathy for that without defending intelligence services and giving them carte blanche, saying, sometimes you err and you make mistakes and you get things wrong, terribly wrong sometimes. But I think often most of them, or the vast majority I've encountered, are just trying to do a really difficult job as well as they possibly can. So having a surprising amount of empathy, more than I thought I would have, for them is interesting. But I guess that speaks to how do you get to be more tolerant as a society? You get to know people, don't you? And you talk to them, you understand them, and then things become easier, I think.
But what about intelligence pushes you to be cynical? Even though you say you're not trying to be cynical, but what did you see that it's like, wow?
Well, I guess bringing back to like police officers and things, I know quite a few police officers in my. I think if you're exposed to things that are the worst side of human nature, if you're exposed to lots of violence, if you're exposed to horrendous things that you don't really want to see, then inevitably that impacts you as an individual. I think you'd have to be, borderline psychotic, I guess, not to be impacted by that sort of stuff. So I think often intelligence officers are impacted by a lot of things that are unpleasant, deeply unpleasant, morally challenging, and put them in positions that are really, they struggle to deal with. And, again, we're thinking about individuals and their frailties. Lots of people, I'll draw some examples of military intelligence. So one individual I knew in military intelligence who served in Afghanistan in really difficult circumstances and was running local Afghan agents. And at the sort of British pullout point, he was told, okay, shut down, you have to let them go. And he's like, I can't let these people go. They've worked for us, they've been really loyal to us. I think their safety will be compromised if we just cut them loose. He had real concerns about their physical safety, the safety of their families. And ultimately he was told, well, that is what is going to happen. So this guy was racked with guilt because he had run multiple agents in Afghanistan. Now he's going home now, but they're in a situation where their lives are in danger, their families are in danger. He feels a tremendous sense of responsibility and guilt for those individuals. So, he came away feeling very cynical about the way state governments and states operate in terms of their own national interests and forget about individuals on the ground who have put their lives at risk to try and help people who they think are promoting democracy or trying to give Afghanistan a better future. They can be collateral damage, I think, and sometimes that can make, understandably, those individuals feel quite bitter and cynical when they think the state has let them down. And that's happened with lots of people in the Afghan Special Forces, for example, who served with Britain in the United States and subsequently weren't given visas to come to the UK, had to stay in Afghanistan with their families, potentially compromised because the Taliban would know they'd served with British Armed Forces. What's their future like? Probably pretty bleak. But
does Taliban have intelligence?
They have an intelligence function, yeah.
Wow.
So they will be quite clear. So Afghan intelligence, actually, interestingly, this is a plug for King's College London. We have the last two former heads of Afghan intelligence before the Taliban took over are visiting fellows at King's College London now. So they've been really useful at telling us about how the Afghan intelligence services operated before the Taliban came back to power. So again, sort of liaison relationships with Britain and the United States, but also India and other powers, and creating an Afghan intelligence service, but also what would happen and what has happened once the Taliban have taken over. So some intelligence officers have jumped ship and have changed, and the Taliban have welcomed them because they want their expertise. Senior intelligence officers have fled Afghanistan because they just wouldn't be safe and their families would be in danger. But they do have a crude intelligence function. It's not an intelligence function that operates at any level of sophistication. We're talking about Western European or Chinese sort of American intelligence functions, but they are quite plugged into local society and always have been, because when you're conducting an insurgency, you can only conduct an insurgency on the basis of quite accurate local intelligence. So they have always been plugged into local village communities and village life, partly through villages cooperating with them, partly through coercion as well. Unless you cooperate with us, this is what will happen to your village. So those networks are quite extensive, I think. I don't think they've got the ability to project that intelligence outside of Afghanistan, for example, so it's limited. But internally, yeah, it's quite effective. So yeah, they are quite adept at knowing who has served with British and American armed forces and where they might be. So it's, yeah, that's I guess what I'm getting at in terms of they are forced sometimes to make ethically difficult decisions or just live with the ethical consequences of decisions they don't agree with. We don't agree that these individuals should be left behind, but we're being told that is what's going to happen. How do I then live with that? As and it can create big mental health issues in certain individuals, and they can struggle to reconcile what they regard as their duty to individuals that they can't honour.
Yeah, there's a big moral thing behind it,
Yeah, absolutely.
which becomes tough. And then, so you teach intelligence at King's College. I kind of have a two-part question, which is, you know, being a researcher in intelligence and then being so, secretive about their things, how do you even get to the knowledge, right? Where do you go to look, and is there even things to research? And then my second question is, I've never heard about courses on intelligence. What type of things do you teach?
So the first question, intelligence research is really challenging, but it's also quite interesting, and it can be quite sort of enlightening. And so it's a different type of research, I guess, from some forms of history or political science, in which you can go to a data bank and just extract the data and make what you want of it. It's much more of a mosaic approach. So, for example, if I go to the National Archives and say, give me the latest files from MI6, they will say, well, MI6 have never released a single file, so good luck. You won't get anything. You get nothing. So like a head-on approach doesn't work. So you have to sort of try and go around an obstacle. And that can be a whole variety of things. So oral history is really important. So
you have to be a little bit intelligent yourself.
You have to use your intelligence and creativity and innovation.
Use their tactics against them.
So oral history is big. So go and interview ex-MI6 officers who now previously been quite reticent of that, increasingly becoming more willing to engage, not necessarily on the record, but openly, also to give the benefit of their experience and knowledge. So oral history is really important. There's a big oral history tradition in America. That's really good. The Britain example is quite tricky because state records are quite limited. Oral history is important. But interestingly, usually people like leave private papers. So if you think, I think that person was in MI6, there'll be nothing in the British State Archives, but maybe they left their private papers to that university and they're in a university library. And maybe the British sort of censors haven't quite got to them yet. And then you go to that library and you look for their diaries and their private papers, and there's lots of stuff about what they were getting up to. So like going to lots of different dusty archives in small places is really important from that perspective. Going to different countries. So I've just written quite a lot about Indian intelligence, but I've done it from British archives because Britain is much more willing to release stuff about Indian intelligence than the Indians are. So you have to think, well, okay, they might not want me to know this, but another country might be, well, we don't care. So thinking about it from that perspective is really interesting. So sometimes you can get that way. Different cultures are different. United States is always the big gold mine of intelligence historians, because the United States, because of its open, more democratic society, as often, and also because it's been involved in quite some big intelligence scandals in the past, and Congress have mandated it to be more open in releasing records. You go to the CIA's website and there are lots and lots of open documents that have all been digitized that are really interesting. You would never get that in the UK. You just don't get it in the UK. But America is a gold mine of intelligence information, both in presidential libraries, in the National Archives, and also in their private papers. And again, they say stuff about countries. Yeah, I was in Guatemala in 1954. This is what happened. You won't find it anywhere else, but you'll find it in American archives. So yeah, being creative is really important. But it's a bit of a labor of love. It takes a long time. It's labor intensive, and it's quite difficult to get a completely accurate picture. So intelligence history is often fractured. Like I've got this piece of the jigsaw, I've got this piece, I haven't got this piece and this piece. So connecting the dots completely is quite tricky, I think. But that's the nature of intelligence. So it's reflective, I guess, in of the practice itself to some extent. In terms of teaching, there isn't much intelligence teaching in the UK. There are King's College London is the biggest intelligence centre. The King's Centre, the study of intelligence, is the biggest in the UK, and we teach undergraduate and postgraduate courses, both in direct intelligence, but also in terms of national security as well. And we're lucky because we're based in London, like you guys. So we get lots of ex-people who worked in the Foreign Office and MI5 and MI6 and GCHQ who come back and lecture for us. And some on the record, some off the record. David Oman, for example, is a former head of GCHQ, is a visiting fellow with us. We have former CIA officers, MI6 officers who come in and say to our students, this is what it's really like. This is what happened. So that's invaluable. So a lot of practitioner support, which is really useful from that perspective. Brunel University have a good intelligence course. University of Buckingham has a good intelligence course, but it's relatively limited. The big intelligence courses are in the United States, although Trump is now shutting them all down. So they did have lots of academic intelligence courses that were linked to American military institutions, Air Force, Navy, but also the CIA and the Pentagon. They are all currently losing their jobs. So Trump is effectively cutting down the history, not only the American military, but also the American intelligence as well. So, yeah, how that will play out, I don't know. But lots of people are going onto social media at the moment saying, "I've just lost my job," or this whole program of military intelligence is just being closed down overnight. Elon Musk and Doge have got in, and they're closing everything down. So, yeah, I don't know how that's going to play out, but potentially that's really worrying because it's a really important component of any society and state's history. And Trump does seem to be, he's doing it with DEI, isn't he? Going into American museums and erasing everything that isn't a white American male, effectively. So if you're a woman or if you're a person of color or you come from an ethnic heritage, you're being whitewashed away from American history. So that's a really troubling trend, I think, that seems to be gaining traction in the United States, really. So, yeah. So American intelligence history was, until relatively recently, very robust and very big. It seems to be shrinking now.
So what kind of job can you get with an intelligence degree?
Well, so we do people who do intelligence undergraduate studies, which is a component of a wider history and international relations degree. But we also have MAs, particularly in intelligence studies. So it's interesting. So some people will try and gravitate into the national intelligence services. So I want to go work for the CIA, I want to go work for MI6 or MI5. Increasingly, people are working in private intelligence. So we mentioned private intelligence companies, massive field now. Lots of companies doing their own private intelligence, so analysis, intelligence collection. Lots of companies that are providing services to corporate clients and sometimes to state governments who are working in that field. So lots of our students might gravitate. The issue with MI5 and MI6 is they're tiny organizations, really, really small in scale, not large at all. So employment opportunities are limited just because of scale. Students now moving into thinking about private intelligence, but also it's just really good at analysis and critical thinking. So if you wanted to move into analysis function in maybe corporate finance or any sort of corporate sort of job, really, intelligence is really good at giving you that analytical ability to look at a case, look at a piece of information, and really get to the root and the core of what it is and make sound judgments on it. So often it's a transferable skill, I think, particularly on the analysis side, which people are deploying in other sort of other walks of life, really.
And you mentioned, so you got some information from Britain about India, and you wrote a lot about India. Did you get any pushback from India, talking about their intelligence? Because, your book really sold really well in India, so a lot of people got information.
Yeah, I think one of the problems about writing about national intelligence cultures is it can become quite politicized. So, for example, there's a BJP government in India at the moment that has a particular how can I phrase this, particular sort of political agenda about Indian history and how it should be framed, and are quite critical of previous Indian governments. For example, the Congress Party, which was in power in India really from 1947 until, the sort of early 1990s, mid-1990s, really. So I think governments can be quite critical of their predecessors and can use intelligence. So I've been I'm really grateful. The book's been well received in India. That's been fantastic. I'm very grateful for it. A little bit disconcerted on occasion when people have chosen to cherry pick facts out of the book and weaponized it to attack previous politicians or previous political parties.
Like what, for example?
So, for example, Indira Gandhi and the Congress government cooperating with the Central Intelligence Agency to launch joint covert actions in India in the 1960s and early 1970s. The Kerala operation, which the Congress Party under Jawaharlal Nehru mounted with the CIA. Some BJP politicians in India have said, "Oh, well, we told you so." The Congress Party was working the American neo-imperialists all along, and they were encouraging the CIA. So it's used in contemporary political terms or in the contemporary political landscape to weaponize intelligence to attack other political parties, where intelligence really, although it obviously is political, every party gets involved in intelligence, and so to just pick particular examples and weaponize that to attack a party in it sort of in the present day, I think is slightly problematic. But inevitably that happens. I mean, Trump's doing it now in America, so it's not an Indian phenomenon. So I wouldn't want anyone to think it was, because Western politicians do that as well. But from a historian's perspective, whenever that happens to your work, it's always uncomfortable when people are picking out certain facts and choosing that to weaponize it in a contemporary sort of setting.
But did they get back to you, like say, hey, look, he exposed, like, or were you not?
Yeah, have you ever been on Indian Twitter? It's a wild place.
Yeah, it looks like it.
Let me tell you, Indian Twitter is wild. Yeah, social media obviously amplifies that sort of stuff in ways that wasn't an issue in the past. So yeah, I get quite a lot of commentary on social media, mainly Twitter, but also other social media as well, which can be quite sort of incendiary and yeah, a lot of it which I ignore, to be honest. But occasionally I'll sort of engage.
Yeah, I think
It's not
Indian
good for your
Twitter.
mental health. Really, to be
Yeah, I mean, as we don't read comments. We just
No,
let it-
I'm very wise.
Yeah.
I agree. It's a rabbit hole you don't want to go down. Yeah.
So, I mean, with
I think you
Twitter-
guys are great. So that's all you need to know. So-
Yeah.
And vice versa.
But I think that is important. Like with just activity on the internet, you can hear so many. But at the end of the day, it's just noise. Like we don't know who. And talking about intelligence now, bots is a real problem, and disinformation and the things like now we don't know what's real or not. So it's best to, I think, just cut it off. And like when we did pods on China and things like that, like you get so many comments of like the CCP and this and that.
It's a really polarized landscape, isn't it? I think, and people feel really passionately about it. Often I struggle to understand why, to be honest, but they feel really passionate and get quite very assertive, and it can be a really sort of toxic place, I think, in that toxic space. And I think any debate is just trying to be empathetic and sympathetic and to try and educate. And no one's going to agree with you. I'm sure lots of people don't agree with a lot of what I've said. That's fine. I'm perfectly happy with that. More than willing to talk to people about it, but in a civilized and constructive way. I don't think it needs to turn into a sort of an aggressive or a sort of a polarized debate around those sort of issues, really. I think, but yeah, I can imagine you guys will get a lot of that, a lot of that sort of content, which is better ignored, I think, more than anything else. Yeah.
And then maybe we can end on this. You talked, you studied a lot, India and the history of intelligence. Where do you see intelligence going forward? How is it going to evolve? And in this, geopolitical tense world with, Ukraine and all this, Israel-Palestine stuff, and there's all these wars going on. Seems like intelligence is becoming more and more important.
Yeah, I think a number of trends are going to happen. I think one, intelligence has become much more multipolar. So you are getting big intelligence players. We talked about China, India, South Africa, Brazil, big global South intelligence players are going to become much more influential on a sort of an international stage, really. Where in the past it's tended to be Russia, lately China and the Five Eyes have been the dominant sort of features of that. That's going to change, I think, and the global South will become much more important in intelligence terms generally. I think the other big trend is going to be that shift away from state power to private intelligence. So Google, Amazon, and big multinational companies are already massive intelligence players, but they're going to become more important as a sort of.
I mean, even
information
Facebook,
revolution
Mark
goes through.
Zuckerberg said that he was basically forced by the FBI to block certain content and this and that.
Yeah. And why do you think Musk bought Twitter? I mean, information is king in the modern world, and having access to that information and what people are thinking and feeling and analysing that through what they're posting on social media, what they're viewing, what they're looking at, is incredibly important, both commercially, but also in terms of intelligence, state power intelligence as well. So I think there's going to be, and I think most state organisations intelligence are quite slow, they're quite cumbersome, they don't have the expertise to really effectively leverage that world. So the only way they're going to do, and also just money and finance and manpower. So the way they'll do that is private partnership. So they'll be working more and more with private intelligence partners, tech companies. There'll be that sort of symbiosis will be a lot closer than it is now. So you'll get a blurring of what's an intelligence agency and how often. I mean, already the CIA has spent a lot of time subcontracting out a lot of its work to, Snowden was a contractor, wasn't he? Comes with risks. He worked for Booz Allen Hamilton and various sort of contracting companies. So there's going to be that process of subcontracting out work, and that creates risk, but also opportunity for intelligence services as well. So that is inevitable. That's definitely going to happen, just in terms of the way the intelligence world is going, I think. But I think intelligence. I mean, I think it's always been important. It's just maybe not been as obvious and as recognised. You go back to the very early very earliest societies. There's always an intelligence function there. It's always been an important part of statecraft, I think. So I think now it's just going to be more visible and more apparent. But it's a really important part of any conflict, I think. It's been a really important part of Ukraine. Sometimes the intelligence is changing in terms of not its sort of its importance, but its method. So the Ukraine, I think, probably has often been portrayed as the first open source intelligence war. So now everyone's an intelligence agent. In the past, you'd have formal intelligence, you might have private intelligence. Now everyone in Ukraine with a smartphone is an intelligence officer because they're uploading stuff onto social media. They're geolocating where they are. That's being harvested by intelligence organizations, both for and against, different sides. So literally that ability to have film content, video content, audio content, geolocation content means that everyone potentially is an intelligence officer fighting.
Even Starlink has been huge, providing
Massive,
satellite content.
Massive, yeah.
And even, I think, powering telecommunications for intelligence.
Yeah. And it also means in terms of analysis, it's not just collection. So we talked about collection and mobile phones and stuff. It's also analysis. Lots of people sitting at home on a laptop working out what Putin's going to do next because they can look at Starlink feeds coming down. They can look at stuff that's on the internet. Famous things like, the internet predicted Putin's invasion of the Ukraine probably a little bit before formal intelligence agencies because they were more nimble, they were quicker. You've got hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people over the world being their own sort of informal intelligence analysts and sharing that information, a lot of which is nonsense, but some of it's good. So, that's just economies of scale, isn't it? It's just like, how do you make that better intelligence service by just making sure instead of having 6 agents on a street, as you did in the past, you have 350,000 people in Ukraine who are uploading stuff on their phones that you find useful, that you can then analyze. So that, I think, is completely transformed. So the ability of open source has been absolutely transformational, and that will continue, I think, as just technology grows and grows and grows. But everyone has a smartphone now, and everyone is a source of intelligence, where in the past that wasn't the case. And global intelligence as well. So, if I want to know about what's happening on the street in Tehran, do I go to the CIA or do I just look on the internet and see what people are uploading on social media? I'd probably go to social media. Yeah. So, yes, that's transformative, I think.
Yeah. Well, Paul, it was an absolute pleasure.
It's a pleasure to speak to you guys. Thanks for really great questions. I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cool. It's a wrap.
Good. Fantastic. Thanks, guys. That was great. I really enjoyed it. It's a nice conversation.